Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm happy to welcome everyone to the final session of our summer series on the dynamics of change. And special welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time today. You can see previous sessions in the series at the link that was in your reminder email this morning. And I wanted to welcome, I think, teaching us for the first time, Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay, who Tani will introduce more fully later. But her session is entitled, Can Institutions Be Nimble? Community Organizing in Tumultuous Times. And she has brought two wonderful guests with her who will chime in with some of their applied wisdom later in the session, and she'll introduce them. And I just wanted to note, we're ending this series with a bang, with kind of a hyper applied focus about making change in the world and community and organizing. And so those who are learning with us every week, it'll be totally different this week, or at least somewhat different this week, and it'll be exciting, and we'll see where we go. We also, just before we start, I wanted to make sure everyone knows about our fall, I was going to say our fall series. We have a holiday series, and then we'll have a whole other fall series after that. But right now I want to tell you about our holiday series, which is called the Torah of the New Year, which is going to start September 6th. And we'll be looking, that series is not on Mondays. That's an aberration for us. But we'll be looking over the course of 4 weeks at some of the various biblical readings that we read during the holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and some of the holidays that follow, with 4 wonderful scholars. So we're putting the link to that in the chat, and we would love for you to register and join us. And as always, it's a new link for a new series. On that note, I'll turn it over to Tani for some more announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format of our session, Rabbi Ruskay will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. And we're also going to periodically open up the chat for some participation as well. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Rabbi Ruskay. As usual, since we receive a large number of questions, we would appreciate it if you could express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received this morning, and we'll be screen sharing a PowerPoint presentation as well. And I'm so pleased to introduce Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay, Associate Dean of the Rabbinical School and Executive Director of the JTS Handel Center for Ethics and Justice. Rabbi Ruskay is a leader in the Jewish social justice sector, and as part of her role at JTS, she focuses on raising the profile of social justice work and community organizing skills for our rabbinical students at JTS. We will also have the opportunity to hear from 2 special guest speakers, Joy Friedman, Director of Organizing at Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, and Rabbi David Baum of Congregation Shaarei Kodesh, and Rabbi Ruskay will share some more information about them when she introduces them later on in the session. And I'm so pleased to turn it over to Rabbi Ruskay.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be together, and thanks for being here. So I'm Stephanie Ruskay, and our topic today is, Can Institutions Be Nimble? Community Organizing in Tumultuous Times. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the experiences that are fresh in my mind and that I'm bringing to this conversation. I have been recruiting and teaching and mentoring rabbinical students for 8 years. In Vermont at JTS, our undergrad program. And I come to this conversation with a lot of appreciation for all of There's also an awareness that the world is changing. And I think that sort of being able to say, how is the world changing and how do we need to change ourselves in order to meet the moment is a wise way forward. And it's really hard to do. It's hard to acknowledge how are things now, even if, especially if we have a great fondness for how they used to be because they shaped us. And especially if we don't definitely know what the answer is for the way forward. So a lot of people who are teach things that are still in formation in their minds that they're trying to figure out, and teaching is how they do it. And so I'm doing that in a lot of ways. I don't know if I can answer the question how organizations can definitely transform through organizing to meet this moment, but I am betting that organizations can, and the ones that we are connected to can. And I wanted to invite you to spend some time with me thinking about it, how I'm thinking about it, and with some of my close colleagues who work at 2 different organizations that are also reorganizing and reimagining themselves for the future. And then we'll see where we get. This is not a one and done kind of thing. This is the beginning of a conversation, an opportunity, I hope, to think differently about the places that you are connected and the people you're connected to. And I hope we'll have lots of opportunities to encounter each other in other ways at a later date. So we're going to start with some text study. Could you please open the first slide, please? The next one, number 2.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. I'm just opening up the slideshow.
So we're going to be looking at Baba Metzia 84a, which is one of my favorite texts, and I teach it a lot. And the reason I teach it a lot is because it sounds very simple and it's really hard to live, and I struggle with it a lot. So I figure if I keep teaching it, I'll keep remembering the lesson. So this is a story about Rabbi Yohanan and Reish Lakish, who were chavrutas. They were study partners for a very long time. And Reish Lakish died. And when Reish Lakish died, Rabbi Yohanan was mourning all over the place. And the rabbis who were his friends and colleagues wanted to take care of him. And so they got together and they said, what should we do to help alleviate his suffering? And so they said, well, we'll send him a new chavruta. We'll send him Rabbi Eliezer ben Padat. And the reason we're going to send him is because we think among us, he knows the most Torah. He is the person who will be the most worthy, a learner with Rabbi Yohanan. So they send him to learn with him. And every time Rabbi Yohanan says something, Rabbi Eliezer ben Padat says to him, oh, there's an authoritative source that supports you, meaning you're correct. Can we go to the next slide, please? And Rabbi Yohanan gets really angry. He basically says, you're a terrible chavruta. When I studied with Reish Lakish, everything that I would tell him, he would tell me the 24 ways that I was wrong. And I would tell him the 24 ways that he was wrong. And at the end, we would know we had thoroughly explored this topic. You just tell me I'm right, he said very immodestly. I know I'm right. I wouldn't have said it, but you're not a helpful chavruta. And he throws him out and he goes back to mourning. And the rabbis feel awful for him. And they don't know what to do. They pray again for him to just have some sort of comfort. And he dies because he can't live without somebody who's really challenging him. So I teach this a lot when I am teaching about social justice, because I think that none of us really knows how to fix the world by ourselves. And we really, really, really have to be in relationship with people who see things very differently from us. And it's really sometimes more fun to hang around with people who see the world just like you do. And so it's sort of a reminder that we come from a tradition where having someone who really disagrees with you and makes you really think through why you have the opinion you have, and that you actually can't live without that, is rooted in our tradition. Okay, let's go to the next text, which is different. And after we've looked at 3 texts, I will tell you why these are the texts I chose for today. So here is another Beit Midrash learning story. Here we have Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. So Rabban Gamliel is in charge of the Beit Midrash, and his way, and this is from Brachot 28a in the Talmud. So his way of leading the Beit Midrash is to make it very small. He limited the number of people who could be there. He was pretty tough about how many hours you had to spend there. He had a guard at the door. He said, your insides have to match your outsides. Like, you have to really be a tzaddik, like a good person. And I could imagine he also thought you had to know a lot in order to warrant being in this Beit Midrash. So the day comes when the community removes Rabban Gamliel and they replace him with Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. And what he does is he throws the door open. He gets rid of the guard. He adds more benches. There, you'll see here, there's a little bit of a dispute about how many more benches, but whether it was 400 or 700, it's a lot. And suddenly more people are learning. Will you change the slide, please? What I think is real, and then Rabban Gamliel finds out that the whole rules of the Beit Midrash have been changed and there's tons more people here learning. And if you think about yourself, like if you were in charge of something and you had a particular way that you thought that it should go, and then the next person in charge has a different vision and they change the rules and they're really different from yours, how would you feel? And how would you treat that person? So Rabban Gamliel, who you could imagine might feel like maybe the students weren't the same caliber as the ones that he was nurturing, or maybe they weren't like learning as many hours and they were going to know less, or maybe they weren't all quite as sort of pure spirited as they used to be in the good old days when he was in charge. Like what he did though, instead of saying you're doing a terrible job with this new version of the Beit Midrash, is he said, oh my God, maybe I prevented people who should have been learning Torah from learning. Like maybe I got in the way of learning, which I think is a really humble way to approach a leadership that follows you. Okay, so that's Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this slide has two different texts on it, and they both might be familiar to you. They're both from Pirkei Avot, and they are both sort of statements about what's most important in the world, right? So the first one is Shimon HaTzadik, and he says, Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omed, Al Torah, V'al Avodah, V'al Gemilut Chasadim. Like there are three things that the world is standing on that are its bases: Torah, like learning, worship, and Gemilut Chasadim. And then later we have Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel saying, no, actually it's different list. He doesn't acknowledge this list, but he says there are three things the world stands on, and it's justice, truth, and peace. So you could say like, okay, they just knew different lists. But Rabbi Yosef Karo says actually that he sees it differently. Like you have to look historically at when these texts were being written. So the first one is at a time when like the temple stood, and it was like a building of a society and a very robust time for growing things. The second text was after the destruction of the temple. Like now it was not like this moment of building a society where you have a temple. Like there's a lot, they've been through a lot as a community. They're living amid destruction. Now focusing on justice, truth, and peace is like they sort of have to maintain. It's a different recipe for a different moment. So I want to just tell you why I brought all of these, and a couple that are on my mind that are not included here. So it seems to me that when we're thinking about what should our communities be like, it might be for the future, for the present and for the future. It could be tempting to only talk to people who seem like they share our idea of what society should look like. And I want to invite us to continuously remember the lesson of having a chavruta who really sees things differently from you. It's also really risky, if you think about that second text about expanding the Beit Midrash, to think about who should be in, who gets to be a leader, who gets to be a learner, who gets to say what the Torah says. There are different ways to approach it, but you definitely get different perspectives when you add 400 or 700 benches of people. And it probably will look different, but it is a choice about how you include people. And then what's included becomes sort of up for conversation. And the last piece on Pirkei Avot is like taking into account which text we need right now. Are we the building a community sort of, we haven't yet had this whole history of building and destruction and exile, or like, are we in a place of optimism, or are we in a place of sort of acknowledging all of the destruction or all of the experiences or all of the changes and adapting? So sort of an invitation to think about, like, if you were going to say now, what does the world stand on? Like, what are the 3 things that you would say? And it might be Torah, Avodah, Gemilut, Chesadim. It might be Din, Emet, and Shalom, or it might be a totally different list. Another set of texts that I've been teaching a lot this summer, and I spent a bunch of time at assorted camps Ramah, is in thinking about community. It's also like how you offer tochacha, how you offer rebuke, because once you start trying to organize your community in a particular way, inevitably, you'll want to tell somebody that they are not doing it correctly. And how you do it, it's human nature, I think, often to get a criticism and then say to someone, oh, you think I do that thing? Well, actually, you do it more. And so there is a Gemara that's in your, it's Arachin, and it's in the packet. And it talks about like a wise person is a person who really appreciates tochacha, who appreciates rebuke, because they know that it makes them better. Again, I'm including it because, like, who likes rebuke? But to remind ourselves that it's beneficial to hear things that are not all how great everything that you do or how great everything the community is doing is, but to really hear where we're falling short and to say, like, actually it was said for a reason of helping us be better. So those are some of the texts that I'm thinking about this summer, and thinking about as we really sort of take account of where are we as a community, and can the institutions that we have reimagine themselves for this moment and for the future. So can we go to the next slide, please? So I wanted you to just think about for a moment, having had these sources, and if we were all together in a room, I would ask lots of you to tell me what you think. But I'm going to ask you to think about it now, and then look for somebody to tell about this webinar later, who you can tell this is what I was thinking. So there have been lots of studies about this, but I often think that, like, we are, even though we're all universes of one, we have reactions to the world that are similar to people that we know. So if you think about, like, how obligated do you feel in your own life to put your time, your resources, your energy, your love, your critique to support Jewish institutional living, institutions that help make the communities that you're part of. So just think about it for a moment, and I'm going to be quiet. Okay, and now I want you to think about generations that are younger, people who are younger than you are, who came after you, and no matter what age you are, you can think about this because we all have people who are younger than us. Like, is it your observation that those people who follow you have the exact same level of commitment to institutional life, and sort of in financial resources and time and love and worry, or is it different? I think that it's probably different no matter how much you felt, and it might be that it's more, but given that it's definitely different, it's a moment to think about retooling and how do we have our institutions be ready for this moment and for the future. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Rabbi Baum and Joy Friedman and I all sort of come out of a community organizing background. Rabbi Baum and I trained with Join for Justice. I'm not sure, Joy, if they trained you or if they just worked really closely with you. Joy is now at the Religious Action Center. But all of us have found that one of the best ways to meet the moment is to use organizing principles to really think about, like, what is the story of who we are? And in my experience, it's not human nature, no matter how amazing a moment in time is, for anybody to want to just continue things that somebody else built in the past. People like to be part of building meaningful communities and institutions for the moment, even if the last ones were great. And so I want to talk a little bit about how you build a communal story, because if you're going to, organizing is really doing something with other people that you could never achieve on your own. And if you're organizing with other people, you have to know what you're organizing for, like what is the story of the community that you're trying to grow. So I want to invite you to think for a minute. All of you are part of some communities. You're part of a learning community on Mondays, and you have varying connections to JTS, but you might be people who have a synagogue that is also your local synagogue, or you might have a chavurah, or you might have a women's league, or you might have a men's club, or you might have lots of things, a youth movement, but some place where you gather with other people who share some of your commitments in the world. And so just to think about, like, what's the story of how that group got to this point? What are the good things that happened along the way? And is there atrophy? Is it not the same as it once was? And then to be curious, like, why did it happen? When did it happen and why did it happen? And what could you learn from it? And where you go after you start to realize that there was a moment where things might have been better or different, or there were more people coming, is like, what are things that we could change or reorganize or disorganize? If disorganize is a scary word, then think about it as reorganize, but something that is like rebuilt for this moment. And what are the things that you need to keep? Like, there were some things that, like, we took the Mishkan through the desert. Like, there are things that we take with us, no matter, we'll probably always be telling the story of having been slaves in Egypt who were freed in order to be a holy people. Like, there are things that you don't throw everything out the window, but some things you figure out how to change, and you want to articulate what are the things we need to keep. Okay, I am going to pause for one moment. Are there any questions? And if they're not, I could keep chugging along, but I do feel like I should ask.
I think you can go for another. I have questions, but why don't you go for another couple minutes and then we'll pause.
Great. So can we go back to the slide? Okay, can we go to the next one? Okay, so in thinking about the story slide we just looked at that we don't need to pull back up, but it's asking us to be really thoughtful about, like, as our community, like, who are we? How did we get here? What could change? And so here, this slide is a way to think about the institutions and the stories that you're telling. So what I just said a moment ago was that I think nobody likes to just maintain something someone else built. So on the left-hand side of this chart, it says institutions built around maintenance. So I think it is easy to go from, we worked so hard to build something, right? To build our synagogue, to build our Hebrew school, to build our anything. it's finally working, right? It's like, we got all these lay leaders, we got the right teachers, like everything's happening. And then at some point, you may realize that it feels a little bit fragmented. Some people are really here for one thing, other people are here for a different thing. There's maybe a faction of the teachers, a faction of the parents, whatever it is, everyone's not on the same page building the same thing anymore. Or you might notice that there's constant activity, there's endless programming. Something is always happening, but it doesn't seem like it's actually building toward anything in particular. It's just like we've always done it this way. So everybody is like busy, kind of passive. They're more like customers than owners of the community. And if we notice ourselves saying like, we have to be cautious, we've always done it this way, that's a moment to ask yourself, like, are we maybe being a maintenance community? Are we maintaining something old because we worked really hard to make it and we thought it, and like it was the right thing, but is it like, are we too afraid to ask, is it the right thing for now? On the other side of this chart are institutions that are built around relationships. They have mission at their center and action, but instead of being all fragmented and all different groups of people who are somehow attached to this institution but not unified, they are united around a common mission. They're focused on campaigns that are going to realize the mission. And campaigns, you're constantly developing relationships to run a campaign. You're doing the campaign, you're evaluating the campaign. And then you say like, okay, we achieved that. What do we have to do next? And you do another campaign. And the people feel like stakeholders, everybody, and leaders, right? Like they're not just people who get something from the synagogue telling them what's happening, but they are people who have ideas for what should happen in the synagogue and they're willing to do the work to make it happen. And the relationships challenge people and support us, and they help us be courageous and creative. So sometimes communities that are relational try things that don't work, right? Not everything is a home run. So they sort of reflect on things that they did that were attempts to move in the right direction, but they weren't overly cautious and afraid to try new things, but sometimes those things don't work. And that's sort of totally okay in organizing. So I want to give you a moment to think, like, are you part right now of communities that are like central in your life that you feel like are institutions that are actually maintaining and could be challenged to move across the chart into relationship building institutions that have missions and stakeholders? Or do you think that you are actually, the organizations that are the closest to you are ones that are built around mission? They do have campaigns that they realize. They do have people who are not customers, but actually are stakeholders. And they are challenging, supportive, and courageous places to lead. So just think for a moment. Okay. So let's do one more slide and then we can pause for reactions. And I'm sometimes a low talker and maybe a fast talker. So I'm going to try to slow down and speak more loudly and closer to the microphone. So when you're thinking about what needs to be disorganized and what needs to be kept, questions you should ask yourself are, is doing this thing our attempt to relive a story that is no longer new and fresh? We're just accustomed to it. Do we always have the same people doing everything because either we couldn't attract anyone else or we stopped trying? And are we doing this, like, why are we doing the same things over and over again? Is it because they're the best things? Is it because it's a habit? Is it because we're cautious and we're afraid to try new things? And you're constantly asking yourself, like, what should we keep? You don't throw out everything. So you want to keep some things. You want to keep the best things that you think are right for the next leg of the journey, even if they're not right forever. Okay, can we do the next slide, please? Now, I want to just remind us about Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. So they were two different leaders who had two different visions. And like people who are leaders do have visions and they are attached to the work that they've done. And so it's really delicate thinking about who are going to, as you're starting to imagine a story of us, like who are going to be the people that do it. And some of them might be the people that were part of the narrative of how you got to where you are and the great things that got you there. And some of them are going to be really excited for the challenge of reimagining a new story of us and building it. And some of them are going to say, I really contributed everything I had to the last story of us, and I'm going to sit this one out. And I feel a lot of grief about that, right? They might not say it in exactly those words. Sometimes people act out how they feel in different ways, but that might be the underlying message is this is really sad for me to not be in a primary leadership role in this place that I always have been to get us to the next leg of the journey. And you can channel Moshe also, right? Like he also did not lead into Israel. So, but really doing kind of an assessment among yourselves about who are the veteran leaders who are like really going to be up for and excited about reimagining, disorganizing, reorganizing. Who are new energy people who you want to bring in who have not yet been leaders in your community, but they could be. And who are the old leaders who you want to find a way to mark the moment and acknowledge the grief of no longer being the central characters in charting the future, but still sort of like have them be in the community, right? And this is like a big piece of trying to navigate relationships within institutions and within synagogues. Okay, now I am going to break and see if there are any things that came up for people.
Great. And I might just add to that last set of questions, for all of our folks who are part of communities and may play a leadership role in their communities, but aren't kind of, the leader or one of the leaders in kind of the formal sense of their communities. Do you identify with one of those groups? Are you a new leader? Are you an old leader? Sort of how does that feel? How do you want to see yourself? So we had a couple of interesting comments on the texts. So there was a comment on the two texts from Pirkei Avot. What are the three things that the world stands on? And this person characterized the first set, the Torah, temple service, and acts of kindness as sort of concrete. They said prescribed ritual acts. I'm reading that as sort of concrete. And the second, the truth and justice and that kind of stuff as vague concepts, which I actually thought they meant the reverse at first. But I wonder if there's, I wonder if you have a comment on that. Sort of, are there times where kind of like an aspirational value, sort of North Star concept, like maybe that's actually what you need to change versus, we need these three things, or any more about kind of how you see the subtle difference between the two texts and the moments that they were responding to.
Thank you. I'm thinking. Well, I wonder if like the Din, Emet, and Shalom, which are the bigger, sort of more amorphous and less specific things, are like when everything feels chaotic, it's maybe impossible, which is when that text was shared. It's like, maybe it's impossible to have specific things, like, because everything feels up for grabs, and where you have to dig in is something that like is very broad, which maybe is a little bit like the Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Beit Midrash. It's like, when things are hard, you have to like invite more people in. You have to, I don't know. I think it's a good question. I don't have a really terrific answer, but I think it's a good observation.
Fair enough. There was a question on, well, actually, one more question on the text before I do the other one. So someone was pointing out that, if you look at the longer version of the Rabbi Yohanan Reish Lakish story, when Rabbi Yohanan is so bereft of his challenging chavruta, that maybe his rigidity is part of what actually led to, maybe Rabbi Yochanan's rigidity is part of what led to Reish Lakish's death, which I'm kind of, taking that as a prompt to think about the ways that we might be presented with the opportunity for a chavruta, kind of a discussion partner or a partner in community building who has a different view from us, that may be right in front of us, but we sort of find ways to not let in. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Well, look, I definitely told the story highlighting the piece about how important it is to have somebody who challenges you, but I think he's a difficult character, right? Like, he was not particularly humble in this. He missed out on loads of chavrutas because he had an idea about who precisely could be the kind of learner with him. And it was only one person. So he probably wasn't that happy, right? Because he could only live with one person as his chavruta. And there was a lot of drama in the story also before the piece where we started, about how Reish Lakish got sick and like what kind of relationship they were having. And so, yeah, I mean, I think Rabbi Yohanan did totally miss out on lots of people who could have taught him a lot in his quest for the best chavruta, which could be, for sure, as we're thinking about like, how can institutions like know who they are for now and the future in tumultuous times. It's like, we might have such a very specific idea about either who should be the chavruta, who should be the people like forming the questions, or what we should be headed for, that we could miss out on a whole lot of possibilities that could change the future. I don't know if that's what you were thinking when you said it, but that's where it led me.
So let's squeeze in one enormous question for you to share a tiny response to, which is, even taking one step back from what you just said. Someone poses a question: how do you move an institution to recognize the need for self-evaluation, especially when there's a cohort that's wedded to how things have been done? How do you even get to the point of conversation where you can ask the kinds of questions you've been putting out?
Well, so I have the feeling that Joy and David are going to share some about that. What I would say, I mean, and that, like, I hope they'll keep that in mind in their presentations, because both of them had institutions that operated one way, and now they were presenting a different way to do things. But I think in some ways it's like, I would say, when my kids were like 5 and they always wanted to know why, I found myself asking questions about the world that like I hadn't remembered to ask for a very long time. And it has been a question that I've tried to sort of keep alive in organizing, even though they're not 5 anymore and they say it less. But like, being a person who's constantly curious, like, why do we do it this way? And do we still need to do it this way? what was the story of how we came to do it this way? And now are we just in the habit? But I feel like why is really important. But the other thing that's really important are relationships. Like if you're just the annoying person who's always asking why, but you don't have close relationships with the people who appear to be making the decisions, they're not like, you're not going to be able to create the kind of change and possibility of disorganizing and reorganizing, because you'll be seen as just sort of like an outside challenger. But I would say, if I felt that there was a group of people who were leading the community that I was part of in a particular way that felt not aligned with the present and the future, I would look for opportunities individually to know some of them and to be curious about, like, why are they leaders around here? What does this place mean to them? What do they think are the things that are great about it? What do they wish it was doing that it's not? But if they could just change things easily, that they would change. And and I would get close, and you can't just make a relationship once and then never connect to them again. You have to, like, if you're going to sort of be a person who's trying to instigate change, I think you got to stay in relationship for a while, and you got to show them that you're willing to do some work too. But I think getting close and asking why, and then thinking about, like, what is the story of this community right now? Like, what is our story of us? And does it sound actually really canned and old? And like, maybe it's not true anymore. Like if we say that we are a thriving, welcoming suburban community with thousands of families, and then we go to shul and that's not who's there, like, then we have to say to ourselves, like, wow, we loved when that was true, and it's not currently true. So how are we going to sort of hold ourselves compassionately and be curious about who are we now? Because who we are now might also be really great. It's just not what our website says. And wouldn't it be better to feel like we weren't faking something that is old, but actually who we are feels true to who we are? And we notice that actually when we were that gigantic thing, we didn't all know each other. We didn't, like, there are lots of things that might not have been true at that time because in those large numbers, they couldn't be true. And now there are different gifts that come along with acknowledging what is actually true today, and then figuring out, so how do we harness those gifts and figure out how to make the best of them and tell the truth about our current story so that we can write our future one. Okay, so I think we should now invite Rabbi Baum. So here's how we're going to do the next section of this. So Rabbi Baum is the rabbi of a congregation in Boca Raton, Shaarei Kodesh, and he's going to tell his story about organizing and disorganizing and how they created a culture together there that speaks to this moment. And then after that, Joy Friedman will talk about her work at the RAC, and then I'll come back on, and the three of us, I'll figure out what we haven't hit yet that feels aligned with where we are. So, Dave. But he's muted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's so great to be here with my my old classmate, Rabbi Ruskay, and so many others at the institution where that gave us so much, JTS. Really an honor to be here. So I wanted to share just a little bit about my story and our congregation's story. I've been serving Congregation Shaarei Kodesh for the last 14 years. It was my first congregation out of Rabbinical school. It was 2009 when we were ordained. It was a very difficult time in the country. It was really the depths of the Great Recession. And believe it or not, there were not enough jobs for Rabbinical students. That has, obviously changed. What happened was my wife was getting her internship. She is a clinical psychologist, and she was being placed in her internship. And we found out about a couple of days before our placement, the rabbinic placement process, that she was going to be placed in South Florida, which is where we're both from. So kind of our focus shifted to me finding opportunities there. And there happened to be an emerging conservative synagogue at the time called Shaarei Kodesh, which was about a 60 family chavurah that had merged with a struggling, very small conservative synagogue. They were looking for their first full-time rabbi. They had hired someone and it just didn't work out. After a couple months, the rabbi decided to leave, and they kind of like were starting over. So I came to the interview, and I had this really interesting experience, because what I noticed was that a number of the people, you think you know why people are there, and everyone thinks that they're all with one mind about what they want to create together. But one of the things we noticed is that there were some people who came from large congregations in town. For those who know Boca Raton, it's like the land of very large synagogues and very few small ones, if any. And some people were looking to recreate what they had in other places, to build the same thing. And a good number of people wanted to build something different. So there was like a Saturday night Havdalah where they sat me on a bar stool and just like threw questions at me. One of the questions was really interesting that really I had to pause. They said, "Rabbi, how are we going to compete with the large synagogues in town?" And I kind of took a pause and I looked at them and I said, "Well, we're not." And they kind of gasped at that moment. And I said, "We're not gonna, what we want to do here, I believe, is not to create something that was already been created. Because if that were the case, you could go to whatever synagogue you want to find your place. We have to be a different community. And we're going to find that out together, what we want to be." And so that kind of began the journey. I had trained with Rabbi Ruskay in community organizing. Specifically, I trained under Jeannie Appelman, who works for Joy for Justice. She has this tremendous background in community organizing, also learned from other community organizers. And one of the things that I did, the first things that I did, and when I interviewed, was to say, I'm going to bring these skills to our congregation. And they loved that until we actually had to do that. And it was, to say, hey, we're going to be setting up these house meetings. And they said, well, we don't want to do that. And, a lot of people said, well, I made enough friends. I don't need to make any more friends. And I said, well, this isn't about making friends. It's about hearing each other's stories. But I said, okay, there's some difficulty here. I said, we'll call them parlor meetings and it'll be meet the rabbi. So that was a way to convince them to do it. And what we did instead was I turned it into, let's meet each other. Let's hear each other's stories. And so we met with about 70% of the congregation at the time over the year. And we asked questions like, what brought you to this congregation? What keeps you here? If you had a magic wand, what magic would we create together? Kind of getting to the questions of what is our purpose, and how are we going to be different here? We talked about talk about times when you took a risk, just to plant those ideas. One of the things that Jeannie taught me was that our most important task as organizers is to be talent miners, meaning that we have to dig deeper into people to see what moves them, what motivates them, and what special gifts they can bring to the world and our communities. And that's something very much that we did during this process, was to identify new leaders, to see what is it that we want to create that we don't even know exists yet. So we've been doing that for a number of years. I've had other diverse experiences. I wanted to highlight one of the things that we did was that I did was being a part of a 2-year cohort with Sid Schwartz called the Clergy Leadership Incubator, Rabbi Sid Schwartz, and the Clergy Leadership Incubator, which really focused on how do we bring innovation to existing institutions. And I actually wrote an article that I sent that you can click on it to take a look. I will tell more of that story. But one of the things that we did, and one of the things I noticed, was that not all the things that we talk about in community organizing necessarily work in the ways that they do in synagogues, that they do in other places. So for example, one-to-ones, training people how to have one-to-one relational meetings is not easy. It was not easy you could train them, but to get people to do it and a campaign, it was much more challenging. So one of the things I did was I created a program called Panim El Panim, which is called, face to face. It was one of my innovation programs where I did a public one-to-one with a congregant that people thought they knew, but really didn't know that well. And they shared their incredible stories. And one of the things that Rabbi Ruskay mentioned was about when we introduce new things. One of the things that I do is that just because we start something, it's not like the High Holiday Machzor. We don't leave it in forever. We let things run their course. And then even when people say, oh, I love that program, we should do that again. And I said, well, that's nice. And maybe we will do it again, but not right now. We're going to do something else. So that's one of the ways that we do it. So you can kind of look at that article where I also speak about one of the things we did was to change even what we call each other. We are in Boca Raton. It's a very, we're a very humble place. We're in a storefront across from a gas station. It started out to be about 120 households that had a low bar for entry, meaning dues were really low, to a congregation. We're about 210, 220 households now with a full-time executive director, expanded our space, so on and so forth. We're still visual across the gas station, but we are kind of like a thicker congregation, I guess you could say. But one of the things that I did was that I wanted to, even though we're a very humble place, and we're still in Boca Raton, which is a pretty affluent area and full of country clubs. And the term member doesn't have the same, it has a little bit of a negative connotation. It kind of denotes exclusivity, so on and so forth. So we changed the term to chaver, and that took time. Chaver meaning stakeholder, friend, partner. And so it was a culture shift. One of the things that we did throughout the years is, how do we orient new people who are joining our congregation to who we are? How do we teach them who we are, and how do we learn from them? And so again, one of the challenges was, I said, we're going to do a spiritual house meeting type thing, or I don't know what I called it. And people were like, what is this thing? I'm not going to go. So we had to use kind of old language. It's going to be a new member orientation. And what we did was we went on our Federation campus, there's a labyrinth, which is it's not like a maze, but it's a kind of a spiritual practice to walk in silence and meditate in a labyrinth. And if you look at it in the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County, you can see it. We do this with all of our new chaverim. They come, we walk the labyrinth, and then they share their personal Jewish journeys and how they got to our congregation. And right away, it's like they get the idea of like, this is a different place, and we're here first. This is different than the place I was at before. I often like to say other congregations like to count people, and we strive to make people count. So of course I can go on and on, but I wanted to just end with a couple of final reflections. This past summer, not this past summer, the summer before, I was at the Hartman Institute for their clergy leadership program. Yehuda Kurtzer, who is now the co-head of the institution, the Shalom Hartman Institution, he taught the text of Honi HaMagel. Honi HaMagel, who falls asleep for 70 years, plants his carob tree, falls asleep for 70 years, wakes up, and he doesn't know anyone, and he doesn't see anyone. And this is like the text that teaches us about what does it mean to be a dreamer. And he said something really interesting. He said, I think that if we can see the fruits of our labor, if we see our dreams fulfilled in our lifetimes, then maybe we didn't dream big enough. And I think about that often, about institutions and what we are striving for. As Rabbi Ruskay mentioned, one of the things is like, you can't just be happy with where you are. You have to always be striving to say, well, what's next? What are we going to do next? How are we going to kind of bring ourselves to the next, to a different group, to the future that we don't know what it's going to look like. And I think that one of the things we're doing right now is not necessarily a strategic plan, but beginning to think about our future in an intentional way. So that's something that we're undergoing now, meaning that just because you're successful doesn't mean that you should just bask in your success and never change, but to be constantly evolving, because as people and human beings, that's what we do. We constantly evolve and grow, and institutions must do the same.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go right to Joy, and then we'll have a little bit of the three of us after. So Joy, who leads at the RAC, and now you're unmuted. So will you please share your story at the RAC of how you have been leading and how you have been working at a legacy institution that is experimenting with another way to be in the world?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm eager to be a part of this conversation and to share what we've experimented with and learned over the last 5 to 8 years. And I also just want to contextualize, I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, in what my family called a conservaform congregation with about 50 families. And I spent the first decade of my career working in the greater Boston area through the Federation with synagogues that were mostly either conservative or reform, and then in the Kansas City area with both conservative and reform congregations. So I spent the last decade at the URJ and the RAC, which is part of the reform movement. I feel connected to your movement as well. When I started working at the URJ and then what became an effort at the RAC, the RAC, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, has been doing justice work for the last 60 plus years. And its tagline was the voice of the Reform Jewish movement in the nation's capital. And when that work was led for the most part under an incredible, brilliant rabbi and lawyer, Rabbi David Saperstein, who became an ambassador under the Obama administration for interreligious tolerance, a global position, which meant that the current director, who was at the time my colleague, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, became the director. And Jonah was also trained in the Boston area. We met 20 years ago when he was working with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization as an organizer. He was a rabbi in a synagogue as well, and he heard from his own congregants so many stories about our broken healthcare system. This was 20 years ago, pre the Affordable Care Act. So many people, particularly people with young adult children, people who worked for themselves, even people with employer-offered insurance, were not getting the adequate and affordable care. And we worked as part of an interfaith effort to change that in the state of Massachusetts, which actually became the blueprint for what turned into the Affordable Care Act. And we saw the power of organizing for change, not only in changing a system, but in engaging leaders from within institutions to own the campaign and be in relationship across lines of difference to bring about change. So Jonah left his synagogue and created something called Just Congregations, where we experimented with doing this kind of work in synagogues all across the country, which was incredibly successful. We learned a lot of important lessons, and especially that it was just really meaningful work, and it allowed for leader and synagogue-led change, both internally in our institutions and in our societal structures, that made for a better world and better congregations for all. So when Jonah became the director of the Religious Action Center, we said, how can we apply the lessons of Just Congregations to this historical institution? And we started by saying that the voice in the nation's capital was not the most effective way to engage the thousands of voices of our leaders from across the movement. And so we wanted to figure out what could we do to engage those voices and still have a real impact. We had two initial experiments. One we called Rabbis Organizing Rabbis, which is somewhat self-explanatory in the name, but I can say a little more. And the other was organizing at the state level in California. which at the time we called Reform California, and we've now since renamed as RAC California. And in both situations, we were able to engage people without limitation. So in California, it was, we said, what could Reform Jews do together across their congregations, even if their congregations were somewhat competitive for members? We said, you know, when it comes to making change at the state level, we're actually more powerful collectively than in competition with each other. And it was an opportunity for folks to say, what do we want to change in society together? And similarly with rabbis across the country, what are the values that rabbis want to stand up for in our country that would make it a better, more whole place for all of its residents, all the folks living in the state? And in both campaigns, we worked on passing policy that would make life safer for both immigrants and citizens of this country by working on immigration reform. In California, the specific reform we worked on was called the Trust Act. It was a law that would allow people, immigrants without documentation, to engage with law enforcement without being turned over immediately to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which without that legislation was making communities less safe because even victims, immigrant victims of crime, would not report the crime to the police because they could immediately get turned over even as a victim. So it was just making communities much less safe. And this was actually legislation that had passed the California legislature the previous year, but the governor had vetoed it. This was not about political party. It was vetoed by a Democratic governor who was getting money from the federal government to keep the program in place because it was of importance to the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Office. So the bill again passed the legislature, and when it sat on the governor's desk, where he was likely to veto it again, we engaged. That happens to be in the California legislature. This is not true in all states, but the time frame is that it passes by the end of the summer and sits on his desk in the fall and has 90 days for him to either sign or veto it, or pocket veto. If it doesn't get any traction, it doesn't move forward. So it was well timed for the high holy days. So about a third of the synagogues, Reform synagogues in the state, about 30 congregations, their rabbi talked about this during the Chagim. And we had a day where we asked for folks during the Yamim Noraim, during the 10 days of awe, to call the governor's office, and 1,000 Reform Jews did, breaking the switchboard and causing, of course, the governor's staff to say, why do Jews care so much about immigration? We also had a congregant in one of those synagogues hear his rabbi's sermon, say, Rabbi, I'm a big donor to the governor. Could I get the two of you on a phone call for you to share what you heard, what I heard today with him? And when he started the phone call, he said, Governor, I was in shul praying for my soul, and I heard a sermon that made me start praying for yours, which happened to be powerful because at the time it was Governor Jerry Brown who had actually considered becoming a priest himself. So he thought about his soul in a particular way. And the 1,000 phone calls, the conversation with this donor, all were, and of course the larger coalition we were part of, which included immigrant advocates, immigrants themselves, were successful. And Governor Brown signed the bill into law. And we thought, this is a model that really works. And we had similar experience with the rabbis working on immigration reform in the Senate. This was back in 2013, although it fell apart in the House. But we said, look, this matters, bringing Jews into action, not just kind of through representation in Washington, D.C., but in action themselves in their own communities, not only changes state policy, but it changed the experience for the Jews themselves to be a part of standing for something that they found resonant in Jewish text and Jewish life, and that would make our communities more whole. So we continued doing that in California, and we built efforts in the 9 states with the most Reform Jews, which probably overlaps with other Jewish communities as well. So we now have a state project, a RAC California, RAC Florida, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas. And through that work, we're engaging more than 2/3 of the whole reform movement in the kind of story I just described. We've worked on immigration reform, criminal justice reform. We're now working to combat anti-Semitism. We're expanding Medicaid for women after they give birth in Texas. We actually had a success there, which felt wonderful. And we're also doing this at the national level. We worked hard on passing voter rights legislation at the federal level and just engaging voters during the federal election campaigns in 2016, 2018, 2020, and 2022. And I should say, we not only measure success by the outcomes of how many people are voting, or whether the legislation we support passed, or whether a ballot initiative we care about passed, but also in how many folks, participants, and leaders we get involved in our work. And we're getting into the tens of thousands of people who do this work. So we feel like that's a big success, because we know that that's part of how people define Judaism, is in the way that they take action, which is both inside the synagogue walls and in our society that they get to do as Jews. And I think that's made our institution, the Religious Action Center, a more meaningful place than when it was a representative body in DC, sort of standing for the whole, but not with the whole. I think I'll pause there, Stephanie, and
Thank you.
can tell these stories.
Really, thank you. So I'm going to draw out a few things that I heard that sounded like related to lessons that we talked about earlier. And meanwhile, Rabbi Andelman, you could see if there are some questions in the queue. And it could be for any of us. But I heard each of you sort of highlight how much each person mattered. And Rabbi Baum, it was like, we don't just count the people, we want every person here to count. And Joy, you you realized that it mattered if you were counting the people who were involved, not just whether the thing passed. And one of the things I heard in your story, Joy, is that like you had a model that you knew worked at the national level. And what you said is like, okay, we know the story of it working nationally for some people works, and we could replicate it in some ways on the state level, and that would be a way to get a whole lot more people involved and feel like they were acting out their values and their Jewish lives on a daily basis, which they couldn't do if there were limited numbers of spots to do on a federal level. So I'm curious, do either of you have questions for each other, also having heard each other's stories, either about why you did it a particular way, or, oh, I see you're now muted again, so. So you can't really ask each other questions. Oh, you're back. But do either of you have reflections on each other's stories?
Okay.
I hear you now.
You hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just the length of time. Were you at all ever frustrated with the, like, if coming into it, were you frustrated if things didn't happen so fast? Change didn't happen so fast.
Sure. I think impatience is probably similar to the feeling from the text we read. The need for tension is I think necessary. I think feeling impatient is important. But I also think the change that we made, we still have, and we had before we started doing more of the organizing of our movement out in the communities in the states rather than just in the nation's capital. We had a group called the Commission on Social Action, which is kind of like not quite a board, but an engagement mechanism that about 115 people sit on, which now, of course, we have tens of thousands of people involved in our work. So we've greatly expanded, but engaging that group so that they owned this evolution and felt supportive and excited about it and helped make it come to fruition was essential. And taking time to do that was worth feeling some impatience over. And Rabbi Baum, I'll ask back to you. I'm so impressed with the growth of your community to go from being more like a Havara at 60 families to now over 200. And I'm wondering more about what you believe attributed to that, and the role community organizing played in that growth.
Yeah, so it I think that just thinking about the role of community organizing, and it was about changing a mentality. Listen, demographics are also just a part of it. There's a lot of people moving to Florida, but one of the things is it was our challenge is it's especially challenging because we're in a storefront, and people are not used to going to freestanding synagogue. So it's about how do we get people to kind of see, like, stepping through that door is a big, like, it's something that not everyone can do. And that was, I think, one of the challenges. So really is about, like, finding the right people. And one of the things that I've grown to as I've gotten older is to realize that change doesn't happen in semesters. I was like 28, I think, when I started, and I thought I was this wise older guy. And I now realize I was like, wow, I was 20 years old. Like, what people must have thought about me as like a kid or something. And I just expected, I remember my first year, I was like, in the spring, we're going to know where we're going to be in 5 years. I thought that that's how the world worked. It worked in semesters. I just come from school. And what I realized that just, organizational development, institutional development, and also human development, it takes time and patience. And we're still, we're still evolving, still changing. And I just think that that's if you could stick with it, if you could kind of like commit to something and go and continue on, that will ultimately bring growth and change. Small, like incremental, but when you look back and you say, wow, like this is, and we had a chance to do that in the spring. We had, we didn't have any history. So it's kind of weird now, 14 years later, we actually have a history, and we started looking back on it and talking about, we started a legacy giving program, I think my third year or fourth year, which they thought was crazy, to offer a planned giving program for a storefront shul that had no history. But we did. And one of the things that we did was in the spring was to look back at our founders, hear their stories about how they saw it at the beginning and how they see it now, our community, and then reflecting on our growth, and not just focusing on these numbers, but on what we've created in the community. And I think that's like what we really focus on, is not, because I know that the only reference people have is numbers. If like that's the only thing, that's what we judge success. But one of the things I've noticed over the years, we might have a time when we had 30 household joins, but they may not have been the right 30. Or one year we had 15, but they were, they had that leadership, or they had that, they were there for the right reasons, and we were able to do more. So it's just like changing a mindset of what does success look like, and going deeper, rather, going deeper into community. So that's something that that I've seen.
Thank you. Okay, so let's invite Rabbi Andelman to bring some of the voices of the people in the larger conversation in and see what they have to say.
Thank you. There's so many good questions on so many different topics. So I apologize to everyone who asked an amazing question, that we're only going to get to some of them. I just wanted to briefly share a comment just related to what you just said, Rabbi Baum. Someone talked about how, sometimes your organization isn't going to change the way you want, and then maybe it's time to go to another organization. Right, you can't always change your organization. I'm not talking about you as the rabbi, but so I think, apropos of your saying, maybe the people who joined weren't, the changes in the synagogue weren't the kinds of changes they were interested in. So I just wanted to share that comment. But there were several questions about political division, and kind of, how to think about the kinds of strategies and values that you're raising in that context that we're also keenly aware of. So I'm just going to share a few of the comments on that topic that came in. So one person talked about, people with different political affiliations within a congregation or within another kind of Jewish communal institution, kind of eroding the sense of, we're all in this project together. Someone raised the, just what's become so common, kind of the vilification of the view on the other side. Someone raised the current political developments in Israel and even kind of within a community and from the outside, what does it mean to support Israel if that's your starting point? Some people are identifying with the government, others are identifying with the protests. If you support the protests, does that seem anti-Israel to the general public? So sort of that whole family of issues, and then similarly, kind of the concern among a lot of progressive folks about rising anti-Semitism in the left. So there you go. All of that about kind of real political division, complicating the strategies and the values that you're raising. And I don't know who wants to take that.
Nobody. Because they're real thoughtful and hard questions. Dave, are you?
Yeah,
well,
I mean, yeah,
live in Florida.
I can't solve all these. Yeah, exactly. I can't solve all these problems with like one speech or anything. I will say this. In my father, when I was ordained, he gave me this like plaque to put in my office, and it was a quote from Pirkei Avot, and I put it like behind the where I could see when I'm meeting with someone, I could see the plaque. And one of the quotes is Ezehu Chacham Halomen Mikol Adam. Who is wise, one who learns from every person. And I think that's an important thing, that we have our beliefs, our political beliefs, and we should have our political beliefs. And we should be proud of them, and we shouldn't apologize for having certain beliefs. I think that the problem is that we are in this like us versus them, time. And one of the things that building a relational community can do is to teach you that the person who is kind of this avatar, online, who's saying all these crazy things, that they're a person, and they might be struggling with something. They might be, this is their outlet, any number of things. But just to understand where people are coming from, and how we can actually learn from every person. Sometimes that is like, okay, I'm going to learn that I shouldn't be doing this. That could be the lesson. But oftentimes it's seeing their perspective, being curious, saying, we feel completely differently about this issue, and I want to know why. Like, tell me the story about how this developed. And you'll see that a lot of the times they'll have some sort of traumatic experience that you said, wow, maybe I would be like that if that happened to me. And you may not believe, you may not agree with them, but at least you'll understand them. I don't know if that brings us to any sort of conclusion, but I think that a lot of it does come down to that relational aspect of it. And that is something that we learned, that I could say Rabbi Ruskay and I learned from our teachers in community organizing, which is community organizing is not like a, this is the issue, and we're always going to stick with it. It's like we have this belief, it's a no permanent allies, no permanent enemies. Like, you can partner with people who think really differently than you because they care about one issue that you can agree on. And there are times it's really hard to put some things aside because it might be that the things that they are opposing are your very identity. And this is a hard thing. So it's not easy, but my advice is to be curious about people.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 2 more questions, right? So let's hear them both, and then we could decide if we could say something that kind of addresses both.
They're pretty different.
Okay, let's hear them, and then we'll decide what we feel equipped to.
Okay. So several people asked questions about resources. So that's kind of the next bucket. If someone quoted the traditional aphorism, Kemach in Torah. If there is no flour, there's no Torah. Meaning, none of the real learning and the growth is possible without financial resources. And to add to that, someone else raised kind of the complication of in a community like a synagogue or other organizations as well, where you may want to bring younger leadership into the fold, and it's the earlier generation that has the checkbooks, so to speak. And then the third point about resources that came up was that there isn't always the next generation of leadership that's even there to step up or has the time to step up. So that was the question, the kind of bucket of questions about resources. The third one's really totally different. So why don't we stick with that for the moment?
How about, because we're nearing the end of our time, how about one more comment from each of you? I'll say something and then we'll sort of wrap up. So it could be related to any of those.
Joy, would you like to?
Sure. I will share that Rabbi Ruskay spoke earlier about being asked the question why by your 5-year-old. I will share that I have a soon-to-be 5-year-old. She'll turn 5 in September, and a 2.5-year-old. And becoming a parent has changed lots of things for me, including my investment in the future. And I think that the kind of general sentiment or understanding that resources, that there are more expendable resources, certainly in older generations than in younger ones, is not a deficit. It's wonderful. I think that older folks investing in the future is imperative, as long as their understanding is that the future is not the past. And I think that actually speaks to a lot about what Rabbi Baum talked about. The more that older folks hear the stories of younger folks and understand their yearning, the better. I think that whether we're in 2023 or 1923, what older folks needed is not what the next generation necessarily needs. But investing in the essence of the ikar of what we care about, Jewish life, Jewish identity, Jewish action, Jewish practice, in a way that allows the next generation to engage with it in a way that works for them, is imperative. So I hope that it's not a problem that the resources, the majority of resources are in the older generation, as long as they are invested in and in relationship with the new folks. And open, of course, to the changes that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful comment. I think one of the things we have to do is to not to make generalizations, to say, if you're older, you have money, and if you're young, you don't. And I just think it's just not true. There are some young people who have the really tremendous means. And there are some older people who did not, for whatever reason, are really destitute. They don't have those financial resources. So just important to kind of look at, like, not to kind of stereotype. The older generation is supporting a lot of these institutions because that's what they were. That's their legacy, right? That's what they created. I think that one of the things that's helpful is, again, not doing an us versus them, but to be a little critical of each, for younger people who do have means, who are not supporting communities, to kind of say, who have gotten things for free for a long time in the Jewish world, to kind of like say, okay, like just like any other business, right? You have to invest, and we do have to teach that to a number of a generation that really didn't grow up with it, I just think I'm a little bit different. Just my parents are immigrants, and I just had like a different experience of not having generational wealth, not things not being passed down to us because they came with nothing. And you just have to look at sociologically, like how people are raised in that way of kind of like making that leap, because a lot of their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were immigrants. So it's just, I think that's an important thing. I think that when Iman Kemach and Torah, Iman Torah and Kemach, I think that if we can create initiatives, communities, what we found is that there are people, good people, who want to invest in them. And I will say, in our case, I know this is a very different type of community and a very different type of scenario, but we've had our probably our largest donors are anonymous donors who want to remain anonymous, and for whatever reason. And it's been quite an incredible thing that this is something that they say, usually older, but this is something that I want to invest in, that I want to see for the future. And I think that if you do good work, and you're lucky, because it's not just doing good work, you do have to have, the right people in the room, that people will invest.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to just pull up on the screen one thing as we close, because we're nearing, time has flown because we're having fun together. But Tani or Ellie, thank you. So if we can go to the high holiday message, it feels to me like one more. There are lots of thank you. There are lots of places that we could go. I hope what today was sort of a provocation and a stimulation to think about, who are we going to be going forward? Who are we right now at the institutions where we live our lives, or the non-institutions, wherever it is that you live your Jewish life and your civic life? Like, are those places teed up to be what we need today and what we need in the future? And so what you're seeing on the screen right now is a framed picture that hangs in our sanctuary, in our Women's League seminary sanctuary here. It's going to be Elul this week, and it felt to me, I like to stand in that sanctuary at davening right near it, and it's an invitation, like when you're starting to think about who are we, who do we need to be, and particularly in light of that question about like political difference. If our religious communities can't hold political difference, I don't know where in society can. So it's really in our interest to figure it out. And so this is an invitation. This is something JTS used to print. It printed 1 year in a long history of printing high holiday messages in the New York Times. And this is an invitation to think back about people you've had conflict with, and those conflicts sort of lasted years, and you both became so stuck on however you understood it. And it's a reminder that none of us sees all the angles, and an invitation to think about making peace with the people who really need to be part of your story as you start to think as a community, like, who are you and who do you need to be for the future? So I want to tell you, I teach a community organizing class for clergy and lay leaders, and we are due for our next cohort. So if this was interesting to you and you think like, wow, I want to actually explore how communities that I am part of could disorganize and reorganize, then I would like to do that. But I also want to leave you with a little joy. And so like, it is hard work to think about, like, are we like actually in the place where we need to be for the present and the future? So I was a camper mom in the Berkshires last week, and I told them some of the same stories that I told you, particularly about Rabbi Yohanan and Reish Lakish, and about Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. And then they acted them out. And here are some of the kids who were very inspired to play the roles of rabbis. So in case you're worried about the future, here is some of the future. They're all vying for the role of rabbi in the big onstage presentation of those stories from the Talmud. So when I feel a little anxious, I look at them, and I hope you'll remember them too. Okay, Rabbi Andelman.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Ruskay and Joy and Rabbi Baum. We've had a whole series, mostly looking backwards and sometimes inwards on the dynamics of change, and it was great to have a session focusing on people making change today and how change makers are thinking about change very much in the here and now with the challenges that face us. So thank you so much for bringing your perspectives to us and your wisdom, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm just going to take 30 more seconds, because one comment that came in that was so interesting was referring to a Lutheran pastor who's doing a lot of organizing work in that community, and kind of a new paradigm that she has developed on distinguishing between cultures of excellence and cultures of participation. So maybe excellence is not always the goal, and something where everyone is involved is. And I mean, we could talk about that for a long time, but I wanted to squeeze it in just because it's it's shedding some of the binaries and assumptions that I think is a theme of what you all talked about. So I'm going to take that and everything that you raised as a charge kind of for all of us to not be too burdened by assumptions and confidence that it won't work out, because change is possible and we can all be part of it. So thank you again for presenting today, all three of you, and to Rabbi Ruskay for putting the session together. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you again for our holiday series starting on September 6th, and we wish everyone a wonderful end to the summer.